Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law. Who can forget the horrific news about the Jonestown mass suicide? November 18, 1978, 900 Reverend Jim Jones followers die after drinking cyanide-laced punch under the order of Jim Jones. Since that time, the news is equally alarming. April 19, 1993, 81 Davidians, including 18 children, die in their compound near Waco after a 51-day armed standoff. March 22, 1997, 5 members of the Order of Solar Temple die in a fiery group suicide, believing this would transport them to a planet that revolved around Sirius. Previously, 16 members of the order had been found dead in the French Alps, with their bodies arranged in a star shape on the floor. 48 members of that temple also committed mass suicide. March 26, 1997, mass suicide of 39 members of Heaven's Gate at cult headquarters near San Diego. The topic for today's show, cults. Joining me is Janja Lalich. She has been studying cults since 1986, when she left the cult of which she had been a member for more than 10 years. She has written extensively and is the author of highly acclaimed books, and works with individuals who have been involved with a cult, and also works with families who are concerned about someone in a cultic situation. We're delighted you're here, Janja.
Thanks.
And Steve Hassan has been involved in educating the public about mind control and those cults he considers destructive. He is the author of a terrific book on the topic and has appeared on innumerable television and radio shows and is quoted extensively. Thanks for joining us, Steve. The next gentleman you should recognize, Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law, and frequently the moderator of this program. In his private practice during the 1980s and 1990s, Dean Velvel litigated against a cult. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you.
And I'm Diane Sullivan, a professor at MSL. Janja, I wonder if you could tell the audience what your life was like when you were a member of a cult.
Well, it was really a mixture of things. I was in a political cult for about 10.5 years, and initially I thought I had really found something. I thought I, finally had a group of people that would give me purpose and meaning, and it was just the most wonderful feeling in the world, although I was, even from the beginning, sort of cautious and skeptical and wondering, well, really, what is this? But as time went on, the group became more and more restrictive and more controlling of my daily life. And I would say, when I think about it, I mean, the thinking back now from that group, I think the main thought that comes to mind is anxiety, confusion, and fear. Those were the main feelings that I had during most of those years. I, for a lot of that time, was in leadership positions and had to carry out acts that now I find reprehensible, and it was a very, very stressful time.
Do you feel comfortable telling us about any of those acts?
Well, sure. I don't, in fact, one of the ways I think it's important for people who leave these groups is to really look back and evaluate what they did and why they did it, and how people got to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. Our group was very abusive in the sense of having constant criticism sessions where we sat in a circle and somebody got blasted, and I was one of the most harsh of the enforcers of that regime. I also expelled many people. I separated couples. I convinced people not to have babies. I convinced people not to go home for their parents' funerals, not to get married to a particular person. I stood guard over people who were under house arrest for weeks at a time. I was part of a special elite team called the Eagles, who served as a bodyguard for the leader and who we were often sent out to intimidate other groups or former members of our own group. So those were the kinds of things we did which weren't very pleasant.
Steve, were your experiences as a Moonie, and I know that was many, many years ago at this point, similar?
In many ways, yes. I was recruited when I was 19 back in 1974 while a college student, and I basically, within a few weeks after going to a 3-day intensive indoctrination workshop, came to believe that Moon was the Messiah and that the world was coming to an end, that World War III was going to happen in 1977. And I was quickly promoted to a leadership position where I too separated people, interfered with letters and phone calls from families, was involved with fraudulent fundraising practices in the Moonies and doing front group political demonstrations for the Moonies. I was involved for about 2.5 years. Unfortunately, I had a near fatal car crash, which led to my parents intervening, and then I've spent the last 23 years as a mental health counselor helping other families and people recover from mind control.
Tell us a little bit about how you did get out of the Moonies, what it was like. Did you undergo psychological stress when you were contemplating leaving?
I wasn't contemplating leaving at all. I was a fanatic. And you cited Jim Jones, you cited David Koresh, and Herf Applewhite, the leader of Heaven's Gate, and I can tell you that it's cut from the same mold of this kind of total dictatorial, authoritarian figure. And as a member, you're told to emulate that figure. And you're told to suppress your own thoughts, your own feelings are evil. So members are taught mind control techniques. Phobias are implanted in members' minds to give them irrational fears that if they ever leave or even question the group, terrible things will happen to them. And so for me, I was in a near-fatal car crash. 3 days up, no sleep at all, so I almost died. I was in the hospital, needed an operation. My family found out surreptitiously where I was, and it led to a 5-day intensive intervention
So they sent
with former
somebody in.
members. Well, I was lured home to my sister, the only person in my family who was not critical of my involvement, and they took my crutches away. I'd had a broken leg and a cast up to here, and they said, "Steve, we want you to talk to these former members." And of course I said, "Satan, get away from me." And so initially it was involuntary, but within a day I basically saw how much my family was concerned about me. I still didn't believe I was under mind control. I was convinced I was doing God's will. But my father started to break down in tears and said, "Steve, what would you do if it was your son who dropped out of college, quit his job, donated his bank account, and went off with this controversial group? Wouldn't you want to make sure he heard the other side? Just talk to them for a few days, and if you decide you want to go back, I'll drive you back, but at least I'll be able to sleep at night as your parent." And because I knew he loved me and I loved him, and I was absolutely convinced, I agreed to meet with the ex-members, and I was taught what mind control was and came to the realization that, in fact, I had been the victim of a very systematic social influence program that systematically stripped away my ability to think for myself, and that, in mental health terms, created a dissociative disorder in me. It literally split me into a pseudo-identity, a cult identity, that was following Moon as my parent, as opposed to the real Steve Hassan. And it was that new identity that was prepared to kill on command or kill myself on command. It was that level of total dedication.
Is it true that some cults will kill their members if they believe they're going to defect?
Well, Om Shinrikyo certainly practiced that. That's the nerve gas cult in Japan that set the nerve gas in the Tokyo subways. That's one of the most frightening groups I've ever worked with, and people are familiar very little in the United States about it, except in terms of articles saying, you know, we have to be careful about germ warfare and we have to be careful of terrorist groups. But as I see it, and I think Janja would agree, these terrorist groups are really functioning as mind control cults. They control behavior, they control information, they control the thoughts and the emotions of their followers. And they inculcate this kind of total dependency and total allegiance in a military-like fashion to the leader. And so if the leader decides everyone has to be gay, then everyone's gay. If the leader decides everyone has to be celibate, then everyone's celibate. If the leader decides everyone has to do sarin gas, then you have to do sarin gas.
Which would account
very scary.
for the Heaven's Gate group, all the men being castrated, or at least I think most of them.
Yeah, in Heaven's Gate, I think only 9 of them were castrated. The Heaven's Gate had a rule that you had to be celibate, and there was an absolute abhorrence of the human body. They called the human body their vehicles and considered them just instruments for getting through this awful earthly existence and getting to another plane. And there was certainly group pressure then to live under these standards of being celibate and yet live in incredibly confined quarters, and so it's not very easy, and of course people have human emotions. So one of the ways that some of the members sought to relieve themselves of the stress of struggling with normal human emotions was to castrate themselves. But I wanted to just get back to your question, because I think in terms of leaving groups, I actually did think about leaving my group. I was a true believer as much as Steve was, and yet there were times, especially as the years went on, 10 years is a long time to work 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, year after year. You're absolutely exhausted. I mean, the fatigue is something that really wears you down and hinders your ability to think. But when I would think about leaving, because I would look around me and I would think, God, what is happening to everybody? You know, people who were brilliant people, doctors, lawyers, professors, I mean, those are the kinds of people who were in my group, were just becoming shriveled human beings. And I would think, something isn't right here. I would have that thought for a fleeting second. And then immediately you push the thought back, because what happens in these groups is that over time you lose your complete sense of self and you adopt what Steve was referring to, this sort of cult personality. But the real person is still there, so there's this battle that's going on. And at times I truly felt like a schizophrenic. I felt that while I was in the group. And yet, because you're in the context of the group, you're continually choosing for the cult personality, because that's the environment you're in. So the other person is sort of continually squelched. So that you get to the point where, the way I describe it now, I wouldn't have thought about it at the time, but I mean, I felt truly psychologically trapped. I mean, I would see the door and I would believe that I could not walk out that door.
Yeah, that's the
I truly believed if I went out that door, the world would end.
That you would be shot?
No, I don't know what I thought, but the fear is so enormous, and it's not, we weren't a mystical group. We didn't have, you know, a religious worldview. We had a political worldview. We certainly had enemies. We had fabricated enemies. We believed the FBI was going to come and torture us. You know, these were all techniques used to keep us controlled and fearful and paranoid, and to intensify the us versus them mentality. So when I thought about going out the door, in my mind, I could only get as far as the door. I mean, you couldn't even imagine what it would be to go beyond the door, because there was no beyond the door. And that's the intensity with which, the way I'm trying to understand it now, I think what happens is, once you adopt this worldview, the cultic worldview, it's not so much that you lose free will, but your choices are confined and constrained within the context of this new worldview that you have adopted. And that worldview also becomes institutionalized and reified, so that in a sense you're functioning on rote. Just like everyday people get up, go to work, they don't really think about it. Well, every day we got up and we did what we did. We didn't really think about it.
What you were instructed to do.
What we were instructed to do. And as it gets more and more reified and solidified, you don't believe you have other choices.
Before we go further in this discussion, I'd like to talk to Larry about what it was like to be in litigation against a cult for so many years.
Well, I would divide that into two parts, Diane. I'll try to keep both of them relatively brief. The first part is the human part. Some cults have become famous or infamous for taking intimidating actions against lawyers who oppose them, and also ultimately for buying lawyers off with huge settlements from which the lawyers made great sums of money. I personally never experienced that except on one occasion, although my colleagues have, and one of them has experienced it as recently as a few months ago. He is still litigating against this particular group on behalf of a particular client. One of the members of this group was a few months ago was staring in the window of his house at his wife, which is, you know, very unsettling to a woman with a couple of children there and so on and so forth. Unreal, one might say. So this group apparently is still continuing on doing some of the things that it has done. The only thing they ever did with regard to me was we had a federal court of appeals hearing once. And those hearings are normally attended by as many as 2 or 3 people. You know, the audience is usually sparse, would be a way to put it. And this group loaded the courtroom with people, and they were, maybe there's not a nice thing to say, but it was like the great unwashed staring at you, and in many cases, obviously, they were. And afterwards, as people walked out, hordes of these people scores, hundreds of them, including ones who couldn't fit in the courtroom, would just stare at you, you know? And it was very unsettling to my wife. Having been unconventional most of my life, this stuff rolls off of my back like a duck, water off a duck's back. But this was very unsettling to my wife. So from the human standpoint, not too much of a problem. From the professional standpoint, it was an absolute stone wall. They were employing some of the nation's major, it's a small firm, but they are among the nation's major civil rights lawyers. They have, I'll put it bluntly, sold out for hundreds of thousands of dollars. They would produce nothing. The cult members, some of them were lawyers and they'd sit in. They would give you no books, none of the things that a lawyer is supposed to do in discovery would they give you. They'd always argue their religion and not susceptible, therefore, to anything that's going on in court. They would not, it was almost impossible to, depose witnesses. And they were prepared, because they're very wealthy, they were prepared to, and did, spend any sum of money necessary to outlast, outfight, outdo, outstubborn, out-obstinate the opponent. What was right or wrong had absolutely nothing to do with it. And I must say that to a rather considerable extent, the courts, and you're well aware that the misdeeds of the federal courts are one of my, I shouldn't say favorite topics. They're a topic on which I am almost obsessed, one might say.
Not you, Larry.
Not me. No, I wouldn't be obsessed about anything. If I were, I'd be a cult member, right? I've got my own cult. The federal courts let them get away with this to an extent that never should have occurred, because the federal courts are very, very leery of treading on what is at least alleged to be religion,
Right.
to the point where they will not even, or they are loath even to take action against actions that are antisocial actions, as opposed to beliefs which are protected by the religion clauses.
Well, let's stop for just a moment.
That was longer than I wanted it to be. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Let's stop for just a moment, though, and consider the argument that all religions start out as a cult, don't they? So we have to be careful to protect religions. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I think it's important that we protect the freedom of religion. I'm the first person who is for freedom of religion. Although, first of all, I don't know that it's true that all religions start out as cults. I mean, if you look at the religious definition or the sociological definition of the word cult in religious history, it really means a group that's kind of an offshoot of another group that's acting in a strange and bizarre way compared to what the group's standards are. But the reality is that many of these groups that we call cults, first of all, are not necessarily religious. And some of them become religions in order to hide behind this First Amendment issue. And it's quite easy to become a religion in this country. So that I think it's important we are able to defend freedom of religion and yet not shy away from criticizing behaviors and actions of groups, whether they're religious or not. I believe they should be held accountable to ethical, moral, human, and legal standards that every other group is held accountable to.
Right. And I would suggest that we consider the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and use that as the basis for analyzing destructive practices. And my definition, I think Janja and I would agree, and possibly the Dean as well, that is a destructive cult is practicing fraud and deception, and specifically mind control to undermine free will. So it's not the issue of beliefs, it's the issue of inculcating beliefs into someone involuntarily without their permission through use of hypnosis, through use of behavior modification techniques and other social influence techniques. And for me, therefore, the law has still not gotten up to speed to recognize the state of the art, of the technology of social influence. And it presumes a certain rational, conscious volition that social psychology experiments have demonstrated. Humans are not always operating that rationally. In fact, most advertisers are taking advantage of many of the features of human nature.
So would it be accurate to say that your positions would be the government should not be so concerned about investigating a cult under the context of religious freedom, and they really should hold cults to much more ethical behavior?
Well, I think all organizations need to be held to the same standard, whether they're political or whether they're religious. I think just because they say they're a religion doesn't give them permission to violate the law or to trample on people's rights.
I guess, I mean, where I would be uncomfortable is thinking about a lot of government investigations. I'm not someone who would advocate much more government intervention in our lives, although I believe that I agree with Steve in the sense that we need to be clearer about when the line is crossed, when the line of undue influence, which I believe is what is used in the courts in other cases, say elder abuse and other situations where people are defrauded, there is such a concept legally of undue influence, and whether we can extend that to this situation and by what criteria. And I think that unfortunately, because of harassment of lawyers and because of other lawyers perhaps selling out, we don't have the people who are equipped to come up with those standards for us working on this issue. It's not considered an important enough issue or a juicy enough issue or whatever
Well,
from the
I'd say lobbying
legal
against
right.
it by the cults on Capitol Hill is huge.
So I think government intervention is not necessarily what I would see as a solution. I would certainly vote much more for public education, massive public education
Right.
in every avenue.
Although I do think that there is some area where we could create some type of watchdog agency overlooking IRS nonprofit status, that if an organization is claiming nonprofit status under religious guidelines and is systematically defrauding the public, we should not be subsidizing them with our tax dollars. And I think if that type of a government agency could be put into place, a lot of abuses of the bigger cults could be curbed tremendously.
Although I didn't plan to say this on the air, what made me interested in this topic was Heaven's Gate. I just couldn't understand. And so Larry and I have been involved in talking about this show for a very long time. And even the intimidation and the subtle threats that I received trying to put together the show, I thought, public has no idea what's going on. I had no idea. And I said, I'm not going to let them win. We're going to do this show regardless.
Good for you.
But it's a real concern to me,
Yeah.
and one that I think needs addressing.
And let me just skip back to one big point that taps into what Janja was saying, and that is that it is known that the CIA has been doing mind control research since their inception in the 50s and 60s. LSD, electroshock, hypnosis, experimentation. This is all documented. And then there was Jonestown, where a congressman was murdered, and a congressional report was produced saying the brainwashing tactics of Reverend Jim Jones, this is a national health issue that needs to be investigated, that needs to be reported to the public. And still, to this point, there's been no government official that has said, yes, mind control exists. People can be hypnotized, people can be indoctrinated to perform antisocial acts. And to me, that's the scariest thought of all.
Can I make a point about that?
Certainly, Larry.
I think it was Janja who said, or perhaps Steve, in any event, I'm sure they would agree, that
We don't agree.
that you have to have some research done on where, in terms of mind control techniques, as opposed to acts which currently would be considered bad acts aside from mind control, such as murder and mayhem, beating up on people, kidnapping them, keeping them prisoner, this and that. In terms of mind control techniques, there has to be some more done, I think, in terms of research to try to establish where the line is drawn. And I'll tell you why I say this. I know this is going to sound bizarre, but I think in 20 or 30 years people won't think it's so bizarre. Mind control exists everywhere, in every profession and in every business. In our business, you will act in the approved way within large law firms and do the things that they demand that you do, or you don't have a future there. And books have been published now by people who point out that, just as Janja did in a cult, they found themselves doing things to advance within the legal profession that were sponsored by their law firms, that they look back in horror on what they did. The same is true in corporations. The same is true everywhere, because in quote unquote normal society, it's not called mind control. It's called getting along to going along to going along to get along, or doing the things that are necessary to advance within the business or profession.
Being a team player.
And what happens is that you imbibe the values
that's right.
of those who have the power, and that's what they are talking about.
Right.
And I think we're going to have, before a lot of people are going to be willing to tackle the mind control aspect, that we probably need a little better idea of where you draw lines and so forth.
And it's certainly been argued that a lot of the sales companies use those
That's right.
very same techniques as part of their sales training. Before we take a break, I want to spend just a moment, if we could, and talk a little bit about the leaders of cults. Do all cults have at their center an all-powerful leader? And who are these people? What are they seeking? Are they seeking money? Are they seeking wealth and power?
Well, for me, certainly one of the criteria is that a cult has a charismatic leader. Now, that leader may be dead. That doesn't mean that there's still not a leader and that his or her value system is still not in place. But these people are charismatic in the sense that they are able to create a relationship with their followers where their followers believe they are completely dependent on this person and the group formation.
Can I interrupt for just a moment and ask, do the group members think of the leader as a prophet?
Yes. I mean, we thought, in my group, it was a political group, we thought our leader it was a woman. We thought she was the new Lenin. She was our revolutionary hero. She was going to take us into the next level of political enlightenment.
Okay.
I mean, we could have used the very same language so that people believe that their leader has something special and that only that person has it, and you only get whatever that specialness is by being around that person.
Right, and I'd
now,
say, I'm sorry.
I just want to finish. Well, and why they do it, you know, I think it's different with each leader. It's usually a combination of money, sex, and power. Some combination of that. Not every leader is going to need or want the same things, but depending on the leader's proclivities, that's what the group is going to end up doing. That's why you can have some groups are celibate, some groups are free sex, some groups the leader has 99 Rolls Royces, in another group the leader will live in a closet. Right. I mean, it really depends on what the propensities in that person's mind.
But I'd put power at the top of the list, and those other things as sub-things, because that's the one universal that I see. And power becomes an addiction. And the more power you have, the more power you want, and the more you elevate yourself and people project that you are the greatest person. And that's where you can predict that destructive cults will get more destructive over time, because it's a closed system of yes people going yes, yes. And the human nature breaks down ultimately because no one's perfect.
Yeah. One last question before we take our break. Why do cult leaders, at least some cult leaders, bring their members to death? Is it they're losing power?
Well, I think, again, there's not one answer, and I think what's complex about this whole issue, which gets back to what Larry was even saying, is that there's not one answer to any of these questions. It's such a complex phenomenon. But I think that in many cases, I think we're seeing now a number of groups that have been around for some time. And when you have a group that's sequestered, where the leader has had this kind of unbridled power, and if the leader has any kind of pathology, any kind of tendency to act out in a destructive or self-destructive way, then when the conditions are such that he or she gets pushed to a corner or creates the corner for him or herself, then the suicides can happen. Now, some of those suicides have also included a lot of murders, as in Jonestown. Many of those people were murdered. They didn't willingly drink that suicide. Same with some of the Solar Temple people. Some of them were murdered. Heaven's Gate, you can say, yes, people all willingly drank that potion. On the other hand, there was incredible group pressure in that closed system. I mean, once they made those videos and said goodbye to everybody on TV, what were they going to do? Stand up and say, oh, guess what, gang, I don't want to do it? No, honest, good people don't do that.
We need to break here, sorry. We'll revisit this issue after the break. Thanks.
Can you tell which of these children was not born free? Can you tell which of these children was not born equal? Can you tell which of these children does not deserve to be treated with dignity? We can't either. Human right number one. We are all born free and equal.
At the new American College of History and Legal Study in Salem, New Hampshire, you can finish your bachelor's degree affordably and get on the fast track to law school. We teach American history, and you'll receive a rigorous education at a very low cost. The small day and evening classes allow you to interact closely with the distinguished faculty. At the American College of History and Legal Studies, professors don't lecture. Through the discussion method of teaching, you'll be engaged in the issues raised in class. You'll learn to be a critical thinker, a better writer, and a polished public speaker. And you'll be able to compete with anybody in today's competitive marketplace. You can also get on the fast track to law school. Qualified students gain early admission into the Massachusetts School of Law. The new American College of History and Legal Studies offers the junior and senior years of undergraduate education. To finish your bachelor's degree, with the opportunity to start your law degree early, call or visit today.
It's not a national emergency, it's a neighborhood fire. Yet for the families who lost their homes, it's a major disaster. What does the Red Cross do in a situation like this?
We're here to help the families. We give them food and blankets, and we provide shelter.
I was with the families last night, and thank goodness they didn't lose their lives. But in so many ways, they did. When people think of the Red Cross, they think of hurricanes and blood drives, but there's so much more.
The Red Cross is always involved in the community. It's neighbor helping neighbor.
Who pays for all of this to happen?
We help people, people help us.
First to respond with care and relief. Count on the Red Cross to be there for your family. But we're not a government agency. We rely on you. Call the Red Cross because your help can't wait.
Massachusetts School of Law. Legal education that is practical, accessible, affordable, and enjoyable. Offering flexible day and evening classes, full or part-time studies, where candidates are assessed not on the LSAT, but their academic and other accomplishments, providing more professional skills training than any other law school in New England. Massachusetts School of Law. Visit us at mslaw.edu, training students to become successful lawyers and advocates, not just legal scholars.
$400 for the cake.
And the Jacksons came all that way.
$35 a head times 150 people. $1,200 for the band.
Everyone had such a good time.
Nobody even danced.
10 years ago, Jim Pratt only had a 60% chance of surviving his cancer.
And the ceremony was so beautiful.
$250 for the limo. Did you see a limo?
But thanks to 80 years of cancer research,
Did you see how happy she was?
he now has more important things to worry about.
Yeah. I wouldn't have missed it.
The American Cancer Society. We offer hope.
Welcome back to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. Joining me is Janja, Lalich, Steve Hassan, and the Dean of our school, Larry Velvel. We're going to talk next about who's most likely to become a cult member. Steve?
I'd say the most vulnerable are people who don't understand cult tactics, the deception, the fact that very intelligent, educated people who are very sincere. Nobody hangs a sign saying, "Hi, I'm a cult recruiter." No one ever joins a cult knowingly. People who are vulnerable, death of a loved one, illness, graduation, divorce, new in town, moving somewhere, makes them more susceptible and vulnerable. But the overwhelming vulnerability is just ignorance of being a good consumer, that if someone is inviting you to something or telling you to something, you have to ask questions like, what is the name of the group? Does it have any other names? Who is the leader? What are your beliefs? Is it controversial by anyone?
Good suggestion.
And then do independent research. Don't just depend on the cult, the recruiter to tell you the dark side of the group.
And Janja has prepared an excellent graphic that we're going to show to the audience in just a moment. But before we do that, I'd like to ask, do you think it's accurate to say that recruitment tactics are based on deception rather than straightforward disclosure?
Absolutely.
Right. I think in the sense that you don't really know what you're getting into. I mean, sometimes there will be out-and-out deception where it's a front group and you don't have a clue what's really behind it, and you eventually get drawn in. And sometimes it's more subtle in that you know what you're going to, but you don't know what the bottom line is going to be once you sign on as a member, so to speak. And I think just a footnote to what we were talking about, I think the prevalent myth still is that it's young people or college-age kids who get into cults, when in fact, I think that more and more it's people in their 30s and 40s, people who have gotten out of college, who are earning good money, who are able to contribute to the group in some way or another, and that most of the calls that I get at my office are not about parents calling about their children so much as a husband or a wife calling about their spouse, a brother calling about his sister, sometimes even a kid calling about his mom or dad.
Now that surprises me.
That's important information.
Janja, I wonder if we could go and take a look at the graphic you prepared for the audience, and I wonder if you'd take a moment and explain to us, what are the things we should watch out for?
Sure. This is a handout that I prepare that I send out when people call my office or I give out at talks. But mainly the thing to look out for is somebody giving you the bum's rush, so to speak. I mean, it's when people are pushing you to make a decision too quickly, to go to something right away, who aren't giving you time to think through what's happening, who suddenly become your best friend, who invite you to something, say a weekend retreat, but they don't really tell you what's going to go on when you get there. They use a lot of guilt to get you to do something, or they'll say to you, oh, come on, you know, you should come to this. Look who else is coming to it, you know, big football star so-and-so, or, you know, the head of the class, or your coworker sitting next to you. So it's those kinds of pressuring tactics where somebody becomes your best friend right away. And I think it's important to realize that, you know, friendship is earned, and that kind of intimacy is something that we have to earn over time. And so if, not that people should become incredibly paranoid and skeptical, but I do think that we are a little naive and that people are not savvy enough. It's what Steve was saying about being aware of what these groups are and what's out there, and that people are really looking to draw you into something. And these are the most common ways that they do it.
Thank you, Janja. Steve, I wonder if we could take a look at the next graphic that I have prepared. And I'd like to ask you, is it accurate to say that cult methods of indoctrination and control include the following: sleep deprivation, isolation, public confession, hypnosis, reward and punishment, and a strict control of daily activities? Would that summarize most cult methods?
It certainly, those are several important things, but I wouldn't say all mind control groups use all of them. I certainly would, I talk about behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And I have a whole list on my website, freedomofmind.com, for example, of the specific forms of behavior control. But one of the biggest ones is controlling a person's environment. To the extent that you have to live in a central compound, there's more control. To the extent that you live at home but just go to the cult center, you still could be in a cult, but there's less specific behavior control. But if you have to ask a permission for every major life decision, then that's the big thing to watch out for. I want to comment about hypnosis because I'm a mental health professional who's studied hypnosis and hypnotherapy. And whenever you're closing your eyes and you're visualizing, you are going into an altered state of consciousness. And that is not a bad thing in and of itself. But when you're going into an altered state, or you're doing a guided visualization, or your eyes closed exercise, you are going into a state of mind where you are less analytical, less critical, more suggestible. So that if you're in a context of, we just are doing yoga, okay, close your eyes and feel the waves of the ocean going over your body, you are more vulnerable to then the person's making a suggestion of, and something very important is going to be happening in your life soon, or you're on a spiritual journey, or we knew each other in a past life. And that way, ideas can start getting seeded in someone's mind that can be part of this overall strategic recruitment and indoctrination.
You've justified my refusal to do yoga, Steve.
Well, but the thing is that I do self-hypnosis. I practice hypnotherapy in an ethical context. I'm not advocating that these techniques are bad. I'm just saying,
how they're used.
Yeah, exactly.
Beware.
It can be done ethically and give you lots of tools to enhance and improve your life, or it can be used with someone with an ulterior motive to enslave you or take your money, at the very least.
Thanks, Steve. Larry, I've prepared another graphic on what I think are cult practices that have been established through research and legislative hearings. I'd like to ask you if you feel that they are accurate based on your experiences. Do cults typically engage in things like beating and kidnapping and imprisoning, sexual exploitation of women and children, extortion of money, attempted or maybe sometimes even actual murder, the unauthorized practice of medicine or the refusal to provide medical care, the failure to educate children, other criminal acts, blackmail, false smear campaigns, which you've talked about earlier, harassment, the misuse of the legal system, destruction or insisting on people really severing their relationship with their families, in dangerous, unsanitary, and unlawful living and working conditions. Do you think that would be a somewhat accurate list?
Well, within my own limited experience, each of those things was said to have been done by the particular group that I was litigating against, and each of those things were testified to in various legislative hearings or had been found by governmental agencies here and abroad. Often more abroad than here, because people abroad are not necessarily as concerned about treading on rights as we are here. They had been found by governmental agencies here and abroad who had written reports on these things. Since I personally was never a member of a cult, you know, and was never in the cult's physical premises, I personally never, as lawyers would say, you know, I don't have firsthand observation. I have hearsay knowledge. But from everything I read and heard, every single one of those things was, the particular group that I was litigating against was accused of every single one of those things. And I think it had risen to the level where it was pretty well accepted by independent minds that these things had occurred. There had indeed been criminal prosecutions with regard to some of them, and there had been convictions with regard to some of them, and there had been civil law cases in which some of them had been found by judges in the United States.
Thank you, Larry. Janja, is sexual exploitation of women prevalent in cults?
Yes, it is. I mean, actually, sexual exploitation of men and women is prevalent. And I recently did a special issue of a journal called Women Under the Influence, and it was a study of women in cultic groups. And for a piece that I wrote for that, I did just a quick survey of the last 44 women who had come to see me at my office, who were former members of a variety of groups. And every single one of them had either personally experienced some kind of sexual abuse or sexual exploitation, or had been witness to it for others in their group. So that was a 100% rate. Now, I'm not, you know, that's obviously not a scientific study. I'm not saying that's the rate, but it is very prominent because leaders learn that to control someone's sexuality is one of the deepest, most intimate, and ultimate ways that you can control someone. It's such an intimate part of ourselves. So whether they're orchestrating who you're to marry, who you're to be with, whether the leader, him or herself, is actually coming on to you, it's a range of exploitation. But in almost every group, there is some facet of that.
And that could be sexual exploitation of children.
Yes.
Which is, Steve, really what I want to talk about next. First off, I think one aspect of cult life that is often ignored is what it's like for children. The children that are born in cults or the children that are converted along with their family. So I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about either your research or your firsthand knowledge of what it's like for children to live in a cult.
Well, I've been counseling people for over years now, and the people who are most devastated are the people who are either born into cults or brought in by their parents who get recruited into a cult when the kids are very young, and then they come out. Whether they're kicked out, or whether they have a nervous breakdown, or they have an overwhelming health problem and the cult doesn't want to pay for their treatment, they come out to an alien world. It's not unlike someone who's in a prison or in a POW camp and is brought out to society and has to be taught.
Everything.
Everything. Education. Has to be brought to the doctor. Maybe they've never seen a doctor and had a full physical.
Is it likely they've been educated while they were in the cult?
Usually they do their own education, which is basically indoctrination. And there's one cult that I'm working with that's prevalent in the Northeast that considers it a sin for children to have imagination. So if the children are playing with dolls, they are beaten with a balloon stick, a wooden stick, so that they shouldn't have these fantasies and imagination. And in talking with child psychologists, when I tell them this, they gasp and say, I can imagine no worse form of abuse. But then when I go on and discuss children who are systematically sexually molested, sometimes in certain cults by their own parents at the instruction of the cult leader, then we see incredible levels of damage. And helping people to come out is a monumental task. And there are literally thousands of cults and millions of people, Americans, that are impacted here. And most mental health professionals, I know Janja would agree with me, do not understand. Even when someone comes in and says, hey, I'm having suicidal thoughts, most therapists are not trained to ask questions like, well, have you ever been involved with a group that's controversial that told you, anything that if you left, terrible things were going to happen to you, or you should kill yourself? And I believe that there are untold numbers of suicides that are happening directly because of cults, because of cult mind control, because someone's getting out, as opposed to just they're unhappy with their life. But again, the mental health field is blind to this matter, much as they were blind to child molestation issues before the 60s or 70s when it started coming to the fore.
Right.
Steve, you brought up something interesting that I want to take just a minute and pause and talk about. Is it true that children in cults are often exposed to highly abusive behavior, much of it sexual? An example which was cited in the New York Times, which should reflect up on the screen in just a moment, children being sexually exploited. Would you say that type of abuse is the norm?
In certain cults, I wouldn't say across the board, and I think it's difficult when you're trying to describe a broad phenomenon.
Correct.
Because credibility is very important.
Yeah.
And did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think what's important to always remember, when you're in one of these groups, you're under the control of the leader or the next level of leadership, right? So that as a parent, because people are probably wondering, well, how could parents go along with some of these things? As a parent, your loyalty is not to your children, it's to your leader and to the group. That loyalty shifts the minute you adopt that worldview, as I talked about earlier, so that whatever happens to the children, whether you as a parent are doing it or whether you're observing it or whether it's the norm of the group, you go along with it, maybe with that same conflict that I felt all those years in my group, but you go along with it because that's the context you're in.
So you don't step in and save your child.
Or if you do step in, you'll get smashed, and
you're punished.
You quickly learn that you're not supposed to step in, so that there is a continual, again, a conflict going on about that because the loyalties are shifted. The only loyalty you can have is to the leader. Again, there's going to be an array of experiences. Not every group is going to be directly abusive to the children, but I know that in my group, the children were just neglected. I mean, who had time? We were working 20-hour days. Who had time for the children? They were shunted, shuffled off to school, picked up from school, thrown into childcare. Somebody was assigned to watch them one night a week. They had no personal attention. They had no personal time with their parents. Is that abuse? I don't know.
But in the case of the Hare Krishnas, where the kids are taken away from their parents and they were sent to schools where they were being homosexually molested systematically year after year after year, that's what the New York Times story was all about. This is horrific. This is absolutely horrific, and the leadership of this group have taken little responsibility to oust those leaders who were doing the systematic perpetration or doing very little, if nothing, to get therapy to all the victims. And
Larry,
this is
your
terrible.
reaction?
Yeah, I have one reaction. Again, I hope this doesn't strike people as too bizarre, but in terms of the fact that a parent would consider his or her primary allegiance to the leader rather than to the child.
That's the norm.
Forgive me for saying this. This is not different from what went on in Nazi Germany or under Stalin in
That's
Russia.
right. You're absolutely. These are totalitarian societies, little mini totalitarian societies.
And the mind control that Hitler practiced in Germany was just on a larger scale than the Moonies practice.
one
but it's the
reaction
same control of behavior, information, thoughts, and feelings, recoding identity.
Can I make ask a question, or maybe it's just a quick comment? As they were talking, it occurred to me one could think of Nazi Germany as one huge cult.
In fact, Robert J. Lifton, who wrote the seminal book on mind control, initially at the behest of military intelligence, was his initial research. He wrote a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism about Chinese communist thought reform programs of the 40s and 50s of Mao. Went on to write a book called The Nazi Doctors, and talked and applied the same paradigm to the Nazis, and in particular focused on doctors who are, by their training, taught to save life, and yet they were systematically destroying life.
You know, just going back though in history, this summer I happened to, this past summer, I happened to tour a Shaker museum, if you will. And I can remember going on that tour into the school room where the children were taught, and I asked questions back then, right away, because we think of the Shakers, but I said, this is a cult. This was a cult at the time. Were the children free to go? And the answer that I received was they were. They could stay or they were free to go, and they pretty much lived a normal life within the cult. That was the response that I had. And I wonder, in most cults today, are the children free when they're age 18 or 16 to walk out the door?
Well, I think, again, you know, it really is going to vary. It's going to vary if the person was born into the group, raised in the group. It's going to depend on the degree to which the group is sequestered. You know, if you're living on a compound somewhere and you think that's all there is, and you think that if you go beyond a 10-mile radius, some evil is going to befall you, and that's the philosophy that you've been ingrained with over the years, turn 18 or not, you're going to have to think pretty hard about whether you can make that move. So again, it's going to depend on what kind of resources or help you may think exist in that, quote, outside world. If there are grandparents, if there are other relatives who've been trying to keep in touch with you or reach you or send you information, it'll make you a little braver about taking that step into the outside world.
Right, but I also want to add that when I was in the Moonies, people would say, are you free to leave? And I'd say, of course, I'm free to leave anytime I want. And that's an important thing to understand, is that you're taught to say the PR thing, but when it comes to having the tools and the actual ability and free will to be able to walk out the door, that's a different matter. On a simple level, if someone has a phobia of elevators, and every time they think of an elevator, their heart starts to race, their mouth gets dry, and they'd rather walk 30 flights of stairs and get in an elevator. That's what we're talking about in the level when you're in a mind control cult. You can't imagine being out of the group and happy and fulfilled. You can only generate negative images, disastrous images. And so you stay, no matter how miserable you are and how torn you are.
It's the lesser
you
of
have
evils.
no choice.
Did you ever think about going back?
Going back?
After you left?
Well, my group actually ended the way I got out. I was trying to figure out how to escape for a number of years and could never figure out how to do it. And then what happened was, it's a long story, but the group basically imploded, and we expelled our leader and we dissolved the organization. It's quite a remarkable story. I wish more groups did it, but anyway, so there was no group to go back to. Yet, for quite a long time, I still felt the intensity of being in the group. I missed the friendship and the comradeship of my colleagues. And when I did something you know, really brave, like speak out, or when I wrote my first article about the group, which was about 5 years later, I thought they were going to come and get me. I thought the group was going to come and get me, yet there was no more group. That's how deep these thoughts are.
Yeah, and that underscores the fact that just because you're physically out of one of these cults, whether the group implodes or whether you're counseled out of the group, you need therapy to work out and understand all of the methods that were used on you and to come to terms with the horrendous acts that we both did as a leader and such. And both of us have spoken with, I counseled a man who was in Heaven's Gate for 15 years, walked out in 1990, seven years before the mass suicide, but never got counseling. And when everyone in the group killed themselves, he flipped out because part of him felt like he missed his chance to ascend to the higher level. And so he was switching back and forth from his cult self to his real self as people were doing interviews with him. And I sat down with him and explained to him, what is a cult? What is mind control? Went through the criteria: behavior control, information control, thought control, emotional control. Explained hypnosis to him, and he was able to piece together. Because one of the big dilemmas when you get out of it is, I'm an intelligent person. How could I have ever believed this nonsense? How could I have ever believed that Moon was the Messiah, the greatest man in human history?
I could comment, again, it gets back to the differences or lack of differences between cults and what are considered normal enterprises. I think there's a large question of sense of identity involved here. And we have found the same thing in American society. People in large corporations who are downsized, people in major law firms who are no longer a part of the law firm. You find it everywhere that people cannot envision themselves outside the particular enterprise or unit, and they feel helpless to know what they would do if they went outside it. And once they do get outside it, you know, first they're thrown for a complete loop because what has been their sense of identity is completely lost, and ultimately they look at it and say, if they're lucky, this hasn't happened to some people who are downsized, but to others, they look at it, ultimately they say, my God, I would never go back to that kind of thing.
And then people could also argue that Americans are not sleeping enough, so there's a national sleep deprivation pattern going on. But I think there's a danger to generalize and just say everything is mind control, as opposed to looking at it on a continuum where there are levels of destructiveness versus levels of positive application, and case by case making an analysis. And I think the bottom line is, in order to have free will, you need information, critical information to promote different points of view, and you need the mental faculties to be able to consider that information. So when you're in a cult that's telling you don't have negative thoughts against the leader or the doctrine and do thought-stopping techniques to suppress it, you can't consider alternative sources of information.
Well, and I think Larry's point is important in the sense that none of this, even though it's extreme, none of this is really unusual. These are normal influence and persuasion techniques that are taken to an extreme, and so that I think people need to realize that these are everyday things that are going on with everyday people all around you, and it can happen to you. It's not just some weirdos who get into these groups, but that what these groups prey on are basic human tendencies.
Yeah, right. The methods are not mystical. They you really can explain them. Social psychologist Philip Zimbardo of Stanford University teaches a course called The Psychology of Mind Control, in which he reviews the basic literature and has demonstrated that intelligent people are more susceptible in many cases to manipulation of abuse. You take someone who's a total apathetic slug with no education and try to motivate them to save the world. It's a lot harder than a bright college student who's idealistic and wants to make a difference and has a tremendous amount of energy and idealism.
One last question, because we're just about out of time. Larry, if somebody comes to you and they say a loved one has been taken into a cult, I'll use that word, what advice might you give them?
I don't mean to be sarcastic, cynical, or humorous. I'd tell them to see somebody like Steve or Janja.
Thank you.
And so let us throw the ball now into your court.
I'd say very quickly, don't overreact, don't get hysterical, don't say, are you in a cult or you're being brainwashed, but take a curious yet concerned posture. You know, Larry, you seem to be really enthusiastic and different. Tell me about it. And say, you know, Larry, if this is what you're involved with is legitimate, it will be there next week or next month. Let's take a week off and let's look around. Let's get on the internet. Let's look for other points of view, and let's make a good decision.
We got to close. I'm sorry, Janja, you'll have to come back and we'll do part
Sorry,
2.
Janja.
So I want to thank you both very, very much. And Larry, thanks for joining me. And to our viewing audience, until next time, be well. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.